Hey fam! So a few days ago, somebody commented on one of my videos. I think it might have been my very first one. And they were talking about the struggle with world builder's disease. If you've never heard of it, it's basically when you get so caught up in creating the world that your story exists in, whether it's a fantasy, sci-fi, or otherwise. If you get so caught up in those little tiny details that you don't even really focus on your story, your character development, anything like that. And I can totally sympathize, as I've said in videos on this channel before. World building is my absolute favorite part of storycraft in general. I love it when I'm reading about it in other stories, and I absolutely have been obsessed with this since I had a single story to tell myself. So I get it. That being said, I do have a story that I'm trying to tell now, and over the last few years, I've really been working on how to focus on first that story, and then after the story comes all the other little juicy details about the world. So that's what I want to talk to you guys about today in this video, and I hope if you struggle with this, then you will find some helpful tips. Let's go. All right, so the first step that I have personally found helpful, and take it as it works for you, but for me, coming up with an actual story that I wanted to tell was the first step. I have built so many worlds, created so many worlds, and then tried to find a story that I could squeeze into that world, and it just, at least for me, was not really working. For me, coming up with an actual story that I wanted to tell, and the story I'm writing right now, though it's fantasy, it started off being very heavily inspired by a very specific historical event. And so I've definitely made it my own at this point, but that's where I began. So I wasn't so focused on the world itself. What I did was come up with my story, and then as I was plotting out that story, I started figuring, oh, okay, I'm going to need to figure out this. I need to figure out this. So that's the first step. Find your story, and then as you are outlining that story, and whatever your process is, even if you're not a huge outliner, as you're figuring out the main scenes, the main plot points in your story, then you will start seeing, I think it's a very natural process that you will start seeing those different things, like make a list of what you're going to have to figure out. So I'm sure y'all have heard other people say this, but when it comes to world building, you don't want to throw in so much unnecessary detail or info dump or anything like that that it gets boring or slogged down, because just because you create your world and you find it fascinating and you love all of the things that you've come up with, it doesn't mean anyone is going to find it particularly interesting just coming into your novel. Or if they're reading, pages of info dump about something that's not really relevant. Nobody wants to read those books where it's like, 3 pages of info dump in between a conversation to the point where you get to the rest of the conversation, you don't even remember what was happening to begin with because you've just been bogged down with so much. So I think that the best way to begin is really focusing on your story first. And that's my first tip. Ideally, you want to have your main and potentially, if you have any secondary plot lines going on, but those can also come later, but at least have your bare bones outline, whatever that looks like for you, set up and to where you know the main points of your story, you know what needs to go down, either while you're going through and doing this outline or after you've already written it. Go through the outline and see, all right, even if I don't know what kind of world this is taking place in, then I can still see, just based on these things, what I'm going to have to look at, right? So if there are, you probably will want to know some basic things like bare bones politics. Even if it's not a very political story that you're trying to tell, you at least want to know like some of the laws, things like that, but especially focus on things that might affect your character or characters in their story, right? If there is religion involved, how much of that do you need to know? And look at the story that you're telling and just try to figure out, again, this is how I did it, but before I even started writing, I went through and I tried to figure out, okay, what is the most important aspects of my world that I need to know for this first book in my series? So, tip 1 was Figure out what your main story is. Second part of that is to go through your outline and find out what are the primary things you need to know. The next tip that I have for y'all is look at your character. Find out what specifics you're going to need to know about your world based specifically off your character and their day-to-day life. For example, obviously, where do they live? What do they live in? A house, an apartment, a hut, right? A cave? What do they live in? What do they eat? What do they drink? But even if you're writing something based in this world, depending on where your character is going to depend on what kinds of foods and drinks and things like that they consume, right? So make sure you know those kinds of basics, because knowing those basics when you're actually sitting down and writing will stop you from having those moments of like, oh crap, like what is my character doing right now? And it'll pull you out of the writing process. You know what I mean? So even those little details can really help. But yeah, like I said, like who is the political leaders or the political factions that your character has to deal with in their day-to-day lives? How are they educated? Are they in school? Have they graduated? Is there just no education? Etc. Who do they pray to? All this kind of stuff. What kind of clothes do they wear? Did I already say that one? But yeah, all those little details, and you can kind of go out from there. Okay, so the next tip that I would go with is, do your characters at any point in your story have to travel? Is there a war that they're going to have to go to or be aware of is happening anywhere near them? Is there any kind of migration happening? Are they nomadic? Etc. These kinds of things. So if there's travel involved, or if there's just something going on in a nearby kingdom, say, that your characters need to be aware of, how much do you need to know about that, right? Figure out what is the landscape, the types of towns, the cultures, whatever that people might be having to travel through in their migration or whatever is going on, right? If there's a war going on or something like that, do they know why? Do they know what's caused it? Or are they just hearing there's war in the distance, right? It's up to you and the story you're telling. But you see where I'm going with this. Take it step by step and see, how much do I actually need to know? You want to know what needs to be known about these new potentials, essentially. So if there is another culture nearby that this war is happening with, or if your characters are migrating and come across a new people or new tribe or whatever that they've never met before, how much do you need to know about them? Remember, if your character is just meeting these people, they're not going to know much either. So you probably don't need to know a whole lot yourself. But especially look for things as it's related to your story. I'm going to get back to that in a second. Now, the one thing that has really helped me a lot in this process is having a separate file or notebook or something where, as I'm doing all these world buildings, or even as I start writing my story, when I get an idea for something or when something just pops up in the creative flow, if it's not immediately relevant to some part of my story, I just write it down and then forget about it for a little while, right? And you can always find a way when you're going through and editing your first draft to squeeze these extra little details in for just some fun to make your world feel more expansive. But you don't want to necessarily, again, you don't want to get pulled off into world builder's disease, right? It's real easy to do. One more little tip I want to throw in here. While you are obviously trying to focus on just the world building essential for your story to get you going, or taking your notes on the side, that, like I said, that can come back into play later on. And one really fun way to do that is really good for storycraft, I think it makes for a really good story, is while you are world building, if you focus in on a specific detail of something, while it might seem irrelevant in that particular scene, make it relevant for later in your book, or if you're writing a series like I am, make it relevant for later even in your series, because that will help you avoid that problem of, you get, 3 books into your series and you want to do this cool thing, but you haven't really set up for it yet. You haven't left any traces of like that thing being possible, or where does this come from? You know what I mean? So let me think of an example real quick. If it's something to do with maybe there's a part in my story where there's a particular plant that becomes very relevant later on in the story. And my character first comes across it, it is pretty, but it doesn't really seem like it has a purpose. But I do spend some time describing it and where she finds it and the whole experience of that, because later on, towards the end of the book, she's going to find out that she needs that for something, right? So things like that, find a way to maybe, it's like a way of foreshadowing. And people who read a lot or watch a lot of really good shows or whatever, anyone who consumes good stories is going to recognize, even if it's a little subconscious at the time, they're going to remember that thing because you focused on it. And tying everything together in the end is going to be beautiful. That being said, George Martin is one of my favorite authors, and he throws a lot of stuff into his novels as far as world building goes that he himself has even said will probably never be relevant. Tolkien also did this, and Tolkien didn't always have reasons for things in his work. So I personally think one of the best aspects of fantasy itself, like high fantasy, epic fantasy, and to some degree sci-fi probably as well, one of the best aspects is finding those like things that don't really lead anywhere, as long as it's not taking up too much space. If it's like, there's a little bit of dialogue going on and somebody mentions some kind of crazy legend or something going on far off, but it has nothing to do with the main story, but it makes you think, oh, there's a whole other part of this world, or there's this whole thing I don't know about. And it makes the reader want more, and it makes it feel, like I already said, it makes it feel that much more realistic. So those are my tips as far as how I have personally honed in. Yes, sometimes it's still easy to get really sucked in, but that's where you got to practice a little bit of self-discipline and just realize when that's happening, catch yourself. But like I said earlier, if you start off by making that list of what are the most relevant things for me to know, then you can use that list, and it kind of helps with that self-discipline moment, or helping, catch yourself when you realize like, oh, I'm falling down a rabbit hole here. You know what I mean? So I hope that makes sense. I hope this was helpful to anyone who might come across this. I do post at least once a week. I do try often for twice a week if I can. So if writing, reading, any of this stuff is interesting to you, if you've got anything from this, I'd love for you to like, share, subscribe, stick around. Comment below, are there specific tips that you have when it comes to world building? How do you avoid world builder's disease, or is it a really big struggle for you? Let's talk. I want to hear all about it, and I will see y'all very, very soon.